Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you, TEDx, and thank you, Carson City, for the opportunity to talk today. It's very appropriate as my talk centers around capitalism, and the theme of the talk is the agora. And the agora, or the agora marketplace, in those times was the community center where people shared ideas, they shared products, they transacted for goods and services. Even back then, if you had a space in the marketplace and you were selling pears and they were rotten, you weren't going to sustain that space in the market and you weren't going to continue with the quality product. And that certainly is true today in a much bigger community, in a much bigger marketplace. I'm really here to talk today about transformation, certainly my own personal transformation from a mild-mannered accountant to something much less mild-mannered, maybe an industrialist, a systemic manager, a systemic thinker, but even more so, much more so, on the transformation of business and industry, on the transformation of how we operate, cooperate, and interdepend, much more systemically, much more scientifically. I actually started my career, despite those good introducing words, without very much guidance. I seem to always be just pulled to the most difficult or largest challenge. Frankly, sometimes I was just taking opportunities that no one else would. Those jobs that you wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole, I somewhat always had, like an 11-foot pole, sitting in my closet. And my first experience was to be hired to come and work for a global, iconic industrial company. The company had an over 100-year history where they invented, innovated, and created life-changing products. They actually invented the first carbon arc lighting technology. It was a carbon and graphite material science company. They created this carbon arc lighting technology that enabled the first streetlights in Cleveland, Ohio. So I guess before that, we were in the dark. The first outdoor streetlights in Cleveland, Ohio. They even won an Oscar in Hollywood using a variation of that lighting technology to create color in motion pictures. The whole color vision, spectrovision, they won an Oscar. And more recently, they created a graphite electrode product that enabled an entirely different way of making steel, an electric arc steel furnace, which is actually the largest industrial recycling chain in the world. So this company was amazing. But in the late 90s, a private equity firm from Wall Street came in, and they bought the company by investing $200 million. Within a year, they sold out and left with $1 billion. These guys were heroes. These guys were rock stars. These guys were the kings of Wall Street. But they left tragic destruction in their wake. The company was burdened with $800 million of debt. Worse, $80 million of annual interest expense. This is a company that invested over $10 million a year in technology, science, innovation, R&D. They couldn't handle the weight of that debt. Their knees were buckling. What did they do? They hired an army of accountants. And so the accountants come in, they cut cost. They started first, guess where? R&D. Then they went to marketing. Then they went to engineering and sales. But it was not sufficient. The company was insolvent and it was about to be bankrupt. So then they hired me, another accountant, brilliant move. But they got lucky because I really never wanted to be an accountant. I went into the company trying to understand, is there a different way to do this? It is without question, I was nowhere near qualified to do the job that they were hiring me for. Well, that's not correct. To do the job that they needed to be done, which was to transform the company. And then I got lucky, too. I met my teacher. and he was a physicist, and he opened my eyes. And that awakening, that epiphany, is what I want to share with you now, today, on how to go from being a troubled, cost-based, non-sustainable company to a pathway, an evolution, if you will, of how to do business and how to move forward. And our society is mired with the same poor thinking from Wall Street. When you see books that are entitled Inventing Money, or The Big Short, or Currency Wars, you know that we've lost our way. You know that we've lost the notion of and the meaning of what these companies, what these businesses, what these systems are supposed to do. We don't have to change. Survival is not mandatory. And capitalism will not survive if it doesn't transform or evolve. It scares me because it's not just in the business and industry level. When the leader of the monetary system in the world, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, says, hey, don't worry. We have a technology here in the United States called the printing press. We can just print more money. Oh my gosh. Einstein taught us with the laws of thermodynamics that you cannot create something out of nothing. Our Bibles teach us that in every transaction, in every action, in every engagement, we need to create wealth, knowledge, abundance. It's not ethical to create scarcity. Creating scarcity means you're taking from someone or you're taking too much from someone. That's what that private equity firm did to that iconic company. It took. That's what the poor pear farmer did when he gave a spoiled fruit for money and was willing to take the money for a bad product. Those transactions are not ethical. They're legal, amazingly, but they're not ethical. It's not unprecedented. Almost every civilization from Samaria through most of the great ones, Egyptian, China, even my homeland, Rome, and the Roman Empire. They started with a 1-ounce silver coin. 400 years later, they didn't have a printing press, but they just had a 1-ounce coin with only 1/100th of an ounce of silver in it. And they just kept devaluing their currencies. So the lesson is simple. We're not innovating, we're not creating, but we think we can make something out of nothing with a printing press, with a devaluation or debasement of currency. This is why capitalism is not sustainable, not in its current form. And that ethic, that notion of never creating scarcity, exists in the Torah, exists in the Bible, exists in the Quran. In all of our spiritual writings, the ethics are there. Do not create something out of nothing, but do not create scarcity. So there's a new way. There's a new road. There is great thinking that came from primarily, in my opinion, two men, Dr. Deming and Dr. Goldratt. And some of their writings show us that there is a different way to operate. There is a new way to think about the economy. There is a way out of the crisis. And so do we want to be short-term? Do we want to be transactional? Do we want to create scarcity? Do we want to let greed? I've heard some of these Wall Street titans express their philosophy is soundly based, proudly based on fear and greed. Or do we want to be courageous? Do we want to grab that 11-foot pole? Do we want to take the long, hard road to create wealth, to create value, to innovate, to sustain a whole new way of our life? So Dr. Deming in 1950, took a napkin and drew his view of what an enterprise should look like. And it looked like a system. It showed suppliers, it showed activities, and then it showed customers, and it was all interconnected. To this day, the best Japanese companies most covet the Deming Award to reflect quality systems. He revolutionized quality in the world, from Toyota to Ford and beyond. About 30 years later, another physicist, Deming was an American physicist, Dr. Goldratt was an Israeli physicist, and he came up with a theory as well. And his theory was simple. He said, a system can only move as fast as its slowest part. So if a system can only be a system if it has a goal, but it can only move and generate units of that goal based on its slowest part. And he called it constraint. He said, wow, this is great thinking. My teacher, Dr. Lepore, took the notions of Deming and the notion of Goldratt and put them together and said, we can think much more systemically in our world today. We can be much more innovative. We can be much more focused towards a common goal. More dramatically, he identified ways to identify those conflicts that were blocking us from moving to this new direction. He was baffled because as he explained what he did to people, they all said, this has to be right. It's too logical, it's too sound, but nobody would do it. And he couldn't understand why. And so he identified 3 monster reasons why, 3 core embedded paradigms, conflicts that we just can't seem to get out of. And I just want to tell you what they are. How we organize ourselves, how we measure ourselves, and our notions of controlling it all. We're stuck in a box. We're stuck in a paradigm. We're stuck in a mental model. We make assumptions. All of those words are synonymous when we think about these things. First, the organizational design, the system. How are we organized as a hierarchy? Do we want to be organized in a command and control way? Do we want to be siloed? Do we want to be functional? Do we want to design our activities that don't include the other pieces of our chain, our suppliers, our customers, and everything around it, including the community? Or do we want to just be hierarchical? Really, the hierarchy was almost first implemented by Moses and then perfected by the military. And corporate America has gone nuts with it. We have to break the notion of function and hierarchy and become much more systemically organized. We also have to have the right kind of people to work systemically. In a hierarchy, there's often ego and power. There's team. There's selflessness. There's subordination to the common goal. There's reliability and interdependency to your team. These are the characteristics that make a system work more interdependently, more effectively. Shockingly, when you talk to people about it, it's obvious, or isn't it obvious? But when asked to do it, it's very, very different. Trust, reliability, camaraderie, common goal. Then how do we measure it? It's remarkable to me as a certified accountant, as a subject matter expert in generally accepted accounting principles, that we understand that a system can only move as fast as part. But we refuse to use time in any measurement. Dr. Goldratt is on record saying that cost accounting and GAAP accounting is the single most destructive impact on productivity in our businesses today. Understand that every one of our businesses use these measurements to measure themselves. It's so indoctrinated. And I shut down a plant using cost accounting conventions. And I cried when I drove home because I didn't feel like it was right, but the numbers were telling me that it was right. We're taught a different way. Measure the speed at which things move reliably through the system. And lastly, because we're organized hierarchically, and because we use accounting conventions, budgets are our controls. I've been in companies that budget endlessly. They budget for 3 months. Then as soon as they're done, they start budgeting again. They budget. Do they work? I don't know, but they budget. Dr. Deming showed us that the reliability of a system, controlling a system, not with budgets, but with statistical control, will confirm to you that it's 99.9% reliable. And if it's not, you know it the minute it's not. So we go from hierarchical, command and control, cost accounting, budget nightmare-based worlds into a new foundation built on system and quality process. And then we can start to envision how companies might change. We start to think about how they might become interconnected. And oh yeah, let me finish my story about my first company. We did end up cutting costs initially, $200 million in the first 2 years. But then we got reorganized and we learned. I had my awakening, and we reorganized ourselves systemically. We eliminated the budgeting nightmare. We grew our revenue. We hired scientists, we hired marketing managers, we hired engineers. We grew our revenue from $600 million to $1 billion. We cut that debt from $800 million to $400 million. We started to connect the system up with our suppliers, our customers, our community, our trading partners, and created a whole different supply chain, a whole different view of the world. More remarkably, in the last 5 years, so the private equity firm took 1 year to destroy it. It took us 8 years to fix it. The first 3 were brutal. In the last 5 years, we filed 700 new patents. We created 2 new businesses. And 5 years in a row, we were a recipient of an R&D 100 award, the top 100 new inventions in the world. And so with that experience, we start to envision a completely different world and an evolution of capitalism that is sustainable. Thank you.